Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of our podcast. Today, I have with me Nelda Schulte of NeldaSchulte.com. She's the president there, and also the host of Ask Nelda Almost Anything. Nelda, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Not a problem. I guess I should say thank you for joining us, as I'm sure we'll have a number of listeners to this. And for some of our regular listeners and people who've been involved with Tenant Cube, they may know a little bit about me and what we do, but they may not be familiar with you yet. I'm sure some of them are. But for those who aren't, Nelda, could you maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the things you're involved in?
Sure. So you probably know me, or for those of you who do know me, you know me through my Facebook group, which is called Alberta Landlord's Watch, where I offer resources and speakers who talk about different kinds of investments, but mostly it's a resource for do-it-yourself Alberta landlords. Some of the resources apply Canada-wide or North America-wide, but mostly it's catered to Alberta landlords because that's where I live. And I have a business called NeldaSchulte.com, which also caters to resources for do-it-yourself landlords. So those are master classes, different kinds of worksheets that you can edit, videos, instructional materials, blogs, all kinds of stuff. So that's basically what I do.
Well, that's awesome. And that's great. And with respect to the Alberta community, I know here in Canada we have different communities for each of the different provinces, and they always seem to be growing. I'd be interested to learn, how long have you been growing the Alberta community?
Oh, probably for a few years. Like, I'm thinking maybe 3 or 4. I used to have a property management business with my husband, Gil Donkersgood, and it was called Calgary Dwelling Consultants. And it originally started out as a landlord-tenant finding service. So we would find the tenants for the landlords. It was like a matchmaker service. We put all the legal paperwork in place so that we could hand it off to them and they could manage themselves. Because I'm of the opinion, if you have a couple properties, you live in the same city or province, you could probably do the self-management yourself much better and more easily and more cost-effectively on your own. So that's what I did. That's what we did. And then we started getting some pressure from the Real Estate Council of Alberta, and so we turned into a property management business. And we did that for 3-4 years, and then I took the whole business and put it online. So, yeah, it's been, I called the community different things at different times. Now it's called Alberta Landlord's Watch. So I've been growing it for maybe 3-4 years.
That's awesome.
That's kind of a long-winded answer. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So what I would recommend, anybody who's watching this, or even if you're listening, Alberta Landlord's Watch, check it out, especially if you're in the region. You'll want to register and join that community. I know they got a lot of great things going on. But Nelda, that's one origin story, but one other origin story I'd be a little bit interested in hearing a little bit more about as well is your Finding the Light story. I read it briefly after you and I had talked the first time, and I think most landlords have some sort of story where, it was something that caught their eye or some reason that they got into the business. And I thought you had a pretty interesting one and maybe relatable to some of the others that maybe you could share with us.
So my origin story started with when I was a kid. I was about 10 years old, and we had a neighbor who had to leave. I think he lost his job and he couldn't afford his mortgage. And so my parents used to have the neighbors over for dinner fairly frequently. That was pretty common when I was growing up. And they had him over for dinner, and he said to my dad, "Look, why don't you just assume my mortgage? You don't have to pay anything extra. You don't have to pay a down payment. Just take over the mortgage so that I don't get my credit wrecked, and you can own this house." The house was 2 doors down from where we lived. And my dad was not as risk averse as my mother, but because she was so freaked out, she grew up in the Depression, grew up hungry, a family of 14 kids. And she absolutely freaked out. She said, "No way are we taking that on. We're not doing it." So he didn't do it. So they bought the original bungalow for $40,000. 40.
Right. Wow.
$40,000 when I was a kid, when I was like 6 or 7. And then he sold it when I was in my early 20s for $150,000. Now that same property, it's still in a starter kind of community, sells for $400,000.
Wow.
So my dad retired. He was a registered nursing attendant, as is his second wife. And financially they did very well. They saved, they had a pension plan, which no one has these days, but they had one. And, they owned their condo, they owned their cars, they owned everything. So they did very well, but I kept thinking, if my dad would have kept that property, and if he would have rented it out, he would have paid it off, and he would have had the income. And if he would have sold it, he would have had that too. And he would have been so much richer than he is now. And that sort of always stuck in my mind. And so that's why I started buying real estate.
Yeah, and out of curiosity, is that an Alberta-based community as well, or was that somewhere else in the country?
That was in Edmonton. Actually, it was in St. Albert, a suburb of Edmonton.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
And I can imagine how that may influence you. And at what point did you finally decide, I'm going to get involved? Were you pretty young when you knew that you were going to get involved? At what point did you decide, hey, let's try this for ourselves?
Well, I always wanted to buy real estate, but I didn't honestly know how I could afford it because my first career was as a classical singer and a music teacher. So I was making, all of $30,000 a year. So I was not making a lot of money. So I, just paying my regular bills, my rent, car payments, my student loans. I had no idea how I was going to be able to afford a house, but I thought I'll be able to do it at some point. It took me a really long time. And after I switched careers, I went into a second career and I moved to Fort McMurray when I was 40. That's when I bought my first property. But I kept going to real estate seminars before then so that I could see how I could invest, how could I do this. And I went to a seminar where they talked about house hacking, which is basically you buy a house and you either rent out rooms or you rent out a basement suite. And when I saw the basement suite thing, I thought, oh, that's great. That's what I'm going to do. And that's exactly what I did. And that's what everybody in Fort McMurray was doing at the time. It was the boom. Housing was at an absolute premium. There was a huge shortage. Everybody was getting, what do they call it now? Living out allowance, LOA.
Okay.
So you have your regular wages plus you get another few $1,000s tacked on top of that so that you could afford a place to live. If you didn't spend it all on your rent, you could keep the rest. So you could charge anything you wanted as a landlord. It was like a heyday. So people were renting out crawl spaces in their garage. They were renting out tent spaces in their backyards. That's how much of a housing shortage there was. So I thought, man, this is the perfect time to buy a house. So I bought a house. I rented out rooms, the upstairs, and I rented out the downstairs suite, and that more than paid for the mortgage. So that was, that was my first experience of being a landlord, having roommates, having a landlording business.
Well, well, yeah, no, and that's great. And, anybody who's listened to some of my conversations, even our first podcast with our CEO, Andrews, he also had a trial by fire for a completely different reason. But it seems a lot of landlords get into that situation of the trial by fire, and I think we'll revisit that. But before we do, something that stood out to me was you going out to those seminars, which would make a lot of sense because something that you talk about in a lot of your writings and your blogs, which I would definitely recommend everybody go check out, is that education is the key to profitability, as you say, or one of them anyways. And it sounds like you were doing those seminars. Is that something like you practice what you preach? And is education really required for profitability? And how does it help you?
Yeah, it's absolutely required for profitability. Firstly, you need to know what you're looking for so that you see it. When you see it, you know what it is.
Right.
So I wouldn't have known what house hacking was. I wouldn't have had a clue. I didn't know anyone who did that unless I would have gone to that seminar. And also, you have to keep educating yourself as a landlord. I thought I was pretty savvy. It makes me laugh when I look back because I'd actually worked as a part-time leasing agent on top of full-time work.
Right.
So I thought, I know how this leasing stuff works, and I can easily swing this landlording stuff. But when you start having problems, that's when you realize what you don't know. And that's when I started having to go back and thinking, oh my gosh, there's a Residential Tenancy Act, which governs landlord and tenant laws. And
right.
I guess I better pay attention to it because people would call, if I made a big mistake, they'd call and complain about me. And then I'd get this phone call and I'd be like, whoa, what is this? So you need to know the laws. You need to know what are good investments. You need to know what's going on in the areas that you're investing in. There's so many things that you need to know, and it's always changing. Real estate is always changing. And then real estate might stay the same, but the economy changes, which is what we've experienced with COVID, with the recessions. It's always changing. So you have to keep educating yourself. You have to keep staying on top of things if you want to be profitable as a landlord. It's not really a passive sport. They talk about real estate as passive.
They do.
It is not passive.
Right. And do you, well, first of all, I think we all have to agree there. It's certainly not passive. It's certainly portrayed as passive, but once you get involved, it's quite clear that it isn't. You run into one hurdle, you're likely going to run into a lot more right after that. So it's anything but passive. But a couple of things. Do you think maybe then, with your thoughts on, education being so important to profitability may relate to you being a teacher, and then maybe some of your maybe not difficulties, but some of the obstacles that you had maybe working on a lower budget with your first properties? Do you think maybe some of those things tied to developing your perspective on that?
Yeah, they absolutely did. Firstly, being poor makes you try and find alternate ways to do things. So it wasn't like, I had a number of friends who were accountants or business degrees, and they went out, got a good paying job, and they just saved up for a down payment and off they went. Mm-hmm. I didn't have that option because, when you're making $30,000 a year, you have to find more resourceful ways to invest in real estate. So that's one of the things. What do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes.
So, yeah, if you want to do something, you take a look at what you have, and you're like, okay, how can I work with this? So that's the first thing. And then, yes, I always go back to education. And I think maybe my university training does that to me. Every time you think you're going to learn something, you're like, can I take a course? Who can I talk to? Where can I get this information from? The Internet's helped tremendously with that. But there again, you have to watch that what you're educating yourself with is the right source. And I'm going to bring this up because this happens fairly regularly. I'm on a lot of different Facebook groups. People will have a landlord or tenant problem. They go onto a Facebook group and they ask a question. What should I do? People from wherever, all over the country, all over North America, will give them an answer. It may or may not be correct. If you make a mistake, that's on you. And there's serious financial and legal ramifications for landlords for making mistakes. Mm-hmm. So you need to check that you are sourcing the right content. So that's pretty important too. Because the laws for Ontario don't apply for Alberta. The laws for Alberta, for instance, there's pet leases in Alberta. That's legal here. That's not legal in Ontario.
Yeah, well, I think one thing we do have in common, probably not just in Alberta and Ontario, but across the country, you miscrossing a T or dotting an I, it can completely change everything. So you got to be very careful in what you're doing and what kind of advice you're taking. That's a great point. And speaking of maybe some advice for maybe some of the new landlords or maybe even some of the veterans who haven't held up on the educational side, do you have any tips for a few things you can do just with respect to profitability, maybe some small items that can be helpful to keep in mind when you're trying to maintain profitability?
Yeah. The very first one is, well, firstly, as a landlord, you need to know the Residential Tenancy Act for your province. Mm-hmm. That's the big one. Secondly, you need to know how to screen tenants. You need to have a robust tenant screening process. If you don't get good tenants, you cannot be profitable, period. That's it. If they're trashing your place, not paying rent, you could lose your shirt. Don't do that to yourself. If you want to find out what a good tenant screening process is, go onto my website, neldaschulte.com. I've got a free tenant screening video that you can watch that'll take you through the 5 steps. And I have a really cheap course. It's $28. It's 45 minutes, walks you through everything very thoroughly. There's nothing that's been, no stone left unturned. And it's a process that's worked very well for me that I've developed over many years. You're welcome to it. So that's the first thing. You have to have good tenants, and you have to have a good tenant screening process. The second one is maintenance. You have to maintain your property. You need to know what you have to do now, what you can postpone later. So those are called operating and capital expenses. For instance, a capital expense is your roof has to be replaced. Maybe it's not leaking, but you know that it needs to be replaced. The shingles are starting to come loose. It's starting to look a little worse for the wear. And you think, well, how many more years do I have left for this? That you can save up for. You don't have to do it immediately. A leaky faucet, if you don't fix that and it turns into a black mold problem, and insurance won't cover it. They'll say, you didn't maintain your property as a landlord, so we're not going to help you. And that can be a huge expense. So small things like that make a huge difference. And then the other thing I would say that really helps you to remain profitable is do maintenance inspection reports. So write it into your lease, write it into an addendum, if you don't have it in your lease, that you're going to do regular maintenance inspection reports. And so that is whatever your insurance will dictate that you have to do. And usually home insurance policies will say they want you to go in twice a year, 3 times a year. If it's commercial, they probably want you to go in more, but you can't go in every month because a tenant has a right to peaceful enjoyment of the property. But make sure you're going in and you're going through everything, and you're just making a note of what's working, what isn't working, so that you can stay on top of the maintenance. And then let the tenants know you're there for them. Give them a gift card. Sweeten the deal for them. I know landlords who will enter them into a draw. They say, your house is so neat and clean and everything is in such pristine condition. We're entering your name into a draw for free groceries this month or a gift card for dinner. So the tenants are thrilled to see them because they want to show off their nice house, how great they've kept the property, and they want to win a gift card. And then they post it on their tenants' newsletter. They'll say, winner of this week's or this month's maintenance is this person, and look what they won, and they're all proud of themselves. So there are ways that you can encourage your tenants to keep up the property and to let you know if things are falling apart. And then thirdly, I think if you have energy efficient appliances, if you do simple things like educate your tenants, give them one sheets on how to change your furnace filters, put vapor barriers in the doors, use energy efficient light bulbs. I mean, there are ways you can educate your tenants to help them. You can also change low flow valves, slow flow valves. You can change energy efficient appliances. So there's lots that you can do. You can even do energy assessments or energy audits. You can do some yourself, or you can pay to have somebody do them. So those types of things can also help you with your profitability. So you either have to make more money, that's how you're profitable, or lower your expenses. It's the same with all of us, right?
Or ideally do both, right? Yeah. That's great. That's some excellent advice. I'm sure and all our listeners know we're a big fan over here of number 2, screening. If you can stop the problem before it starts, you can really prevent a lot of headache. And I think those other points are excellent as well. And, kind of shifting from that a little bit, I know one thing you've recently talked about is how this is a landlord's market. And a lot of the realtors I've talked with have started talking about how it's also now a buyer's market. Do you think this is a good opportunity for some of those new landlords, given those two factors starting to take place?
Yeah, I do. I do and I don't.
Let's hear it.
Well, when someone says, do you think it's a good idea for me to buy a house as an investment property? Well, it depends on so many factors.
Right.
Where is it? How much does it cost? How old is it? Do you want to be a landlord? How involved do you want to be? Can you afford to have a property manager? It depends on a ton of different things. But right now what I'm seeing, which we knew was going to happen, the Bank of Canada starts raising the interest rates. So that makes it more difficult for people to buy properties. Mm-hmm. So they're staying in the tenant market longer, which is good for landlords, depending on which province you live in. Alberta is more landlord-friendly than BC and Ontario, unfortunately. Right. Hopefully we can start changing the legislation in that area. But would I advise people to buy a property and rent it out to tenants? Yes, if you can afford it. Yes, if you can find a way to afford it. Yes, if you educate yourself so that you can maintain your profitability and your sanity. Because if you have bad tenants, as you know at Tenant Cube, your life is not going to be very peaceful.
Right, yeah. Absolutely.
And I don't like drama in my personal life. I like to have a very calm home life, No crazy phone calls, no crazy texts. I like things to be calm in my life.
Right.
So, bearing all those things in mind, what can you do that works with your personal situation that gives you peace and profitability in your life? And I do think real estate is a very good investment. I mean, look at my dad's property, $40,000 when I was age 6. Now it's $400,000. It will pay off in the long term. Historically, real estate is an excellent investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's one thing for everybody who's considering, whether it be your first or your growing portfolios, whatever it may be, something that is not often discussed enough. is stuff outside of the numbers. It's the peace of mind, it's the sanity, and it's making sure that you're going to be able to, exist a peaceful existence when you have those properties or when you grow that portfolio. Because to your point, if something does go wrong or you end up in let's say a situation you don't want to be in, perhaps with one of your tenants, that can really cause you a lot of harm, both financially but mentally as well. So I think those are some great points. You might want to make sure you're happy and comfortable with what you're getting into. And, one other thing is I think landlords are unique in the sense that they're very community oriented with respect to how they develop and they network. I find whether it's somebody like yourself who has a lot of experience and is doing a lot of networking, or it's somebody who has just gotten started, everybody wants to get involved with these communities, like Alberta's Landlord Watch and some of the different communities that are out there, whether you're a veteran or you're new, everybody wants to get involved. What do you think some of the benefits that new landlords would receive from joining something like the Alberta Landlord Watch? Like what benefits are there going to be for their learning process, their development in those sort of communities?
Well, education for starters, because I post a tremendous amount of resources on Alberta Landlords Watch. They're on my website as well. And as we both mentioned, you have to keep educating yourself. Legislation changes, the economy changes, everything changes, so you have to keep up on top of that. Secondly, support. When you're doing anything new, even if you've been doing something for a long time, you really need to have some support, because there's sometimes people will text me and they're in crisis and they want to talk to me, and I'll say, "Ooh, this is a legal problem. I've got a lawyer I'm going to refer you to, or I've got an eviction specialist I will refer you to, or call the police. Don't call me here." So just having the support of the community so that you can bounce ideas off of them. There are times even, I've been doing this for 18 years, and sometimes when I have difficult situations, I get on the phone, there are like 3 or 4 people that I'll call and say, "I just want to run this past you." So it's really valuable to have a supportive network and to have people who are in the know, experienced landlords who follow the legislation, who can support you and help you and guide you and steer you in the right direction. It's also really important to join groups that have access to resources that are necessary for you. Like I always tell people to join Alberta Residential Landlords Association, ARLA, or Calgary Residential Rental Association, or whatever city you're in, there's a landlord and tenant association, and it's a very good idea to join it, because you can call them, you pay a membership fee, and they usually charge you per the number of properties that you have or the number of doors, and you can call them and say, "I've got this situation with the tenant and it's like this," because the RTA is very black and white, but when you deal with people, you get all shades of gray. So now this person has got this situation that sort of fits into this part of the RTA, but because this and this are happening, and they could tell you, well, in the last court cases that we've seen over the last 5 years, this is what's happened, this is what the current trend is, this is how they've ruled, this would be our advice. You can also contact Service Alberta. They have a Landlords and Tenants Association, but they're just going to quote you directly from the RTA. So if you download the RTA Handbook and you read through it, that's exactly what they're going to tell you. So if you don't know it at all, that might be a good source for you. But I like to have a little bit more fleshed out information, and I also like to see examples. You're going to get that from Facebook support groups like mine, like Ontario Landlords Watch, like there's another really good Alberta Landlords. They're excellent. Tenant Cube has a lot of good resources, of course. Front Lobby has really good resources. I mean, join groups. Join legitimate groups that can support you with correct information and with people who are supportive and kind towards you. If anyone's rude to people in my group, I kick them out. We have to be kind to each other. It's hard enough being a landlord.
Right.
You need a supportive environment. So if you join my group, if you join a lot of the other groups, people are going to be nice to you as well. They're not going to say, "Well, that's a dumb question." Every question's a dumb question until you know the answer. You have to start someplace.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all that makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I think I've gathered from the conversation is, one, that the key to profitability is education, and some of the places you can go for education are going to be groups like the Alberta Landlord Watch, or going to see professionals like yourself, again, at neldaschulte.com. And Nelda, that was some great information. I think there's a lot of great takeaways here. So thank you for allowing us a few minutes to pick your brain, and I hope we can do this again.
Well, thank you. I hope I can too. Thank you so much for talking to me. It was really great. Fun
Awesome.
thing to do. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Nelda.
Yes, and definitely join 10 and Cube. It is such a great deal. I wish this would have been around 15, 20 years ago when I started. Thank God they cater to the small landlord. Thank you.
We do, yeah. The growing portfolio and the everyday investor is who we're trying to help. And you guys can always check us out at tenantcube.com. Find, screen, and lease qualified tenants is what we're all about. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thanks so much.